Carol Hepper. This was a great show to put together. I think it demonstrates from the breadth of the work, the incredible vision and guts and risk that the founder of PICA, Kristy Edmunds, the founder and artistic director, had. I mean, so many of these artists weren't well known at the time, whether they're Jim Hodges or Din Culé or Francis Elise, and now, of course, they're very well known. At that time, you might remember, though everybody that was here, there were no other institutions other than the Portland Art Museum. PCVA had closed. There were no academic curators like there are now. So starting PICA was a bold move and important, and it wasn't easy. And we'll talk about how curating in communities. Anyway, this show shows the first 10 years, and I think that we could all agree that Kristan Kennedy and Angela Maddox and Aaron Boberg have continued that vision and bringing challenging artists to Portland. So PICA is a very viable and important institution. So from PICA, Kristy went all the way over to Melbourne and became the artistic director of the Melbourne International Arts Festival from 2005 to 2008 and curated equally as important shows. I think there was one you did with Rauschenberg and Cage, and they're just pivotal exhibitions at important times, anyway, it was a whole series of exhibitions. You can look online. And then in 2009, became the consulting artistic director for the Park Avenue Armory, where she worked with people like Ann Hamilton and other major artists. And then now is the executive and artistic director at the Center for the Art of Performance at UCLA, where you just did a Matthew Barney piece. So you're back on the West Coast, which is great, but you've always remembered the Northwest artists. You took M.K. Guth, who was the first artist from the Portland Northwest to be in the Whitney, to Melbourne and other people. It's a pleasure to have Kristan Kennedy as well, who is an exhibiting artist. One of her pieces with Topher Sinkinson from Swallow Press is right here. And Kristan's been curating the visual arts at PICA for the last decade. So I thought part of the conversation, we're going to have just an informal conversation about what it is like to curate from the artist's perspective. When we were talking, I do have something from Ann Hamilton I want to read. And the whole thing is in the binder, and I highly recommend. But I think that both of you can speak to being practicing artists and curating and how that might make a difference in your curatorial style, and then the communities that you work in and how that changed what you were able to do. So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks. Is that the start?
There you go. Yeah.
Well, this is such it's a really humbling experience. I mean, a lot of people in this room helped me when I first moved to town, but these two women up here certainly did. Liz Leach represented me for a long time and was one of the very first people to say yes to Topher and I when we started a sort of anonymous collective in about 1995. She lent us the space next to her first gallery and paid for our insurance and let us do all kinds of crazy things over there while putting blinders over her eyes and supported us for many years, so thank you. And Kristy thought she was being stalked by me and Topher, and then that turned into many invitations to participate, and yeah, you're an incredible friend and mentor, and thank you so much. So one of the things I was thinking about is the sort of exuberant, foolhardy nature of being a young person who sees a void and decides to do something about it, and that kind of the kind of energy you need to start something new, and perhaps the combination of like wisdom that comes from nowhere and to like move forward when all forces sort of are pointing in the opposite direction. So can you talk about being 28 and what Portland was like and what gave you the impetus to try something new?
Well, I think, what Portland was like is obviously very, very different, and so many people in here have authored a very different identity inside of what the city actually is and what this place is. I had been working as a filmmaker in residence for the Northwest Film Center, and then I was also hired by the Portland Art Museum to kind of, at the beginning, coordinate a performance program with John Weber, who many of you would know and love, who was reflected from when Portland Center for the Visual Arts had kind of closed its doors. There was an orchestrated merger with the Portland Art Museum. And at that time, I didn't live here. I was finishing grad school. But when I got here, it was very clear to me that the pressure underneath the Portland Art Museum at that time, having never really addressed contemporary practice with any rigor, the merger was there as much as a political statement, the pressure of a political statement to absorb something, as it was an opportunity for the museum to actually address contemporary practice in a different way. And you have to kind of keep in mind that without certain collectors who had contributed modernist work into the museum's collection, even modernism was not mined over the arc of time that it was happening. So we were fully in postmodern practice, discipline boundaries collapsing and a variety of other kinds of things. And in that I was learning, and I remember really clearly at one point, I was like, what is a board exactly? Every time a board member is around, everybody gets all weird. So I had to say to John Weber, when I was 23, I was like, what is a board?
Oh, that's hilarious.
So the art museum authentically was a point in which I was on a different kind of learning curve. And it was a learning curve of, mainly, when I look at it, there were two big things besides John, who's one of the fairest and greatest curators, I think, ever. So I had him to kind of protect me from not knowing, right? But there were two big things that happened to me in that. One of them is that I felt the weight of a kind of, weight in a good way, the gravity, the gravitas and gravity of how to respond to the heritage of PCVA. So it wasn't something I knew and understood, really, because I hadn't been here, but it was something that I could understand and feel, that I had the privilege of upholding an integrity of purpose that had been manifest through that organization, and then having to protect it politically from the art museum at the time, which was sort of like, let's do this thing, and then it's going to fail, and we will have done our thing and proven the contemporary work is not going to, So it was going to be a perfect virtuous circle of goodness. Was that really? No, I'm telling you the truth here. This is the truth. So, the art museum itself has transformed utterly, and it's not due to that merger. It's due to a variety of other kinds of things. And it's a remarkable, that transformation inside of the museum, frankly. But at that time, that was kind of what was going on. And so that was one piece. I felt a connected tissue to a responsibility to stand on the shoulders of a thing that I didn't, that there would be no shoulders had that not been there. And then the other thing that was going on a lot was looking at the commercial galleries and really seeing all of the commercial galleries that probably function still to this day. They were covering off a way of being an authorship in a visual arts community differently, right? More like the Kunsthalle practices, almost like a not-for-profit. It's not like you had these massive collecting moments going on. And I remember there was a huge amount of energy to try and create a deepened sense of identity. And then the other, obviously, was the artists, the caliber of the artists who were here, which was not the mandate of what became Art on the Edge in the museum. It was to deal with national or international practitioners inside of the local community. But at a certain point, there was a change, and that change was connected to a museum now going in a different direction. There was the Eminent Capital campaign, which was going to be a major process of renovation, acquisition of the Masonic Temple, all these things. And inside of it then, there was a slight pressure, I would say, just between us, friends. There was a slight pressure going on around how exhibition practices might fuel a successful capital campaign. And that was where I had to kind of learn something different. What would that mean for the Art on the Edge program? By then, John Weber had gone and I was running the whole thing. And there was a moment too where Portland State University had cut its contemporary dance program. Right. So there was that. So what I was seeing is that there was I started to sense intuitively, I think, that what I'd been working on in the museum was figuring out how do you create a different door for people like me to come through the institution at that time. Really, like the front door was not going to be the access point for contemporary artists. The back door might be, but I had to figure out where to put it, right? So to say that in symbolism or metaphor. So I at least had an understanding of that, and that's what Art on the Edge was fulfilling to a certain extent, but many other programs inside of larger institutions had already struggled or were gone. So you could feel a sense that momentum was moving counter to the contemporary zeal and exploration of here, and that it needed to. So when I started PICA, literally, that was like a doodle on a napkin, as many of you might remember, after I left the art museum. And I had commissions for my own work as an artist, so I knew I had a few months to survive financially, but there was no other job, there was no other position. But I had felt really strongly that there was momentum, and if we moved quick enough, there would be a way to connect audiences who had kind of lost their programming base, or were soon to, in the Art on the Edge, into a self-standing organization that would either live or die based on the value system that a community held underneath it. But I had no idea what I was doing. Absolutely none. So that's not really, I forecast all this because it's important in terms of informing. It's not like I was just 28 years old and some lightning bolt struck my mind and I went, yeah, off I go. It wasn't that. But you're right, the naivete of that, coupled with a kind of passion, created enough energy that the possibility could take shape.
Right, and other people were there with you.
Oh God.
You know, whether it was in, you know, Joan Shipley's backyard or the old Liz Leach Gallery having meetings with you to try to make this thing happen.
Yeah.
Is it part of this idea of like what an institution is and where the front door is?
Yes.
Does this have something to do with why we had no door in the beginning? I mean, just thinking about starting something formless, or the idea of starting from scratch and keeping things, I mean, I'll say anti-institutional in the beginning, or not fettered by federal funding, not that we would have been, you would have been eligible.
Lining up to give us
but I think there were some important distinctions in the beginning about where we would take money from, what would happen, what kinds of artists, and those all seemed like very poignant decisions. So I'm wondering about the kind of form it took. Like your first season, your first event, like what was the thinking about how it would land here in that moment?
Well, the first form, I mean, it was sort of like, I felt like one of the, I don't know what the role is, but when you work at a railroad station and you're in charge of moving the boxcars, if you can get a certain number of them lined up, then the thing can go. Basically, that's the metaphor of what I was doing. And that boxcar was a lot of artists who had entrusted me when I was at the museum or as a collaborator in their own work, with their work and with those ideas. And they believed in the potential of this thing. So there was that. There was some patrons and collectors, in some cases collectors of my work, who had at that time enough resources and they wanted to get behind the idea. So I had to get that boxcar happening. And then there was place. Portland had a lot of empty, different kind of warehouse spaces. Portland had, you know, this Pearl District was starting, but it had not, obviously, and River District was kind of coming. Thank you very much, Al. And, you know, there was something about the honesty of place where trying to go after the building of an institution to demonstrate the weight and gravitas and possible success coming out of right out of the gate wasn't going to be germane to the place at the time. But the use of a civic way of artistically inhabiting that which was kind of empty or in transition seemed honest. It seemed honest to hear. much harder to do now, and I commend anyone who's attempting it, and I know a few people who are, but it's, and also there wouldn't be overhead, and there wouldn't be the weight of a lot of overhead, there wouldn't be all these other kinds of things. It was just unencumbered at the time in that way. But the original board, I mean, another thing about Place that was very honest and informing it was, we in Portland tend to create barn raisings around things that matter, right? And so, Boer Architects and Portland Arts and Lectures had taken me in. I was literally, PICA was a notepad, a pencil, and a Rolodex, if you remember what those were, right? And so there was a way of the in-kind mechanism being kind to the possibility. And that surrounded something that was very affirming. And then patronage started to come in. Tactically, we decided at the beginning not to pursue foundation support or government-related grants for a variety of reasons. One, at the city and regional level and state level, direct funding for independent artist practitioners was not a very substantial sum of money. So if you ended up in a kind of competition around those resources, to me it was like PICA and myself could be more beneficial by sitting on committees awarding funding than by seeking that same funding. There just wasn't very much. And this was an ecological strategy. There was also the thing of, if we couldn't survive based on membership and independent philanthropy and attendance at the beginning, then we would create a mechanism in which possibly, we would be awarded a grant, but if it didn't come back, how would we have developed a sustaining? So we made a calculated strategy to not pursue those kinds of resources for at least 3 years, so that we had something to offer, not something only to take, if that makes sense.
But artistically, where were you at? What did you want to see here, or how did you program or curate in the beginning? Did you call it curating?
I can't remember.
Yeah.
Yes, I did. And yeah, I did call it that, and I remember that being a little bit of a problem in certain strands of culture here. Because,
Yeah, there was.
Because I didn't come from an art historical pedigree of an academic degree in that regard. I came from an artistic practice with enough kind of curatorial access from working in the past with artists in different forms that there was that kind of energy, but it was not the sort of sanctioned thing from an academic pedigree that would do it. So when I called it, a curatorial practice of some kind, people were like, yeah, right? But the difference was that, and I think you can probably relate to this very well, working with artists, when you're an artist yourself, you read the places in between what they're seeking to manifest, right? You can see, you don't have to see the end result to know that the endeavor is going to be a valuable endeavor. And so you stand not from a place of fear that you will fail, right? But that the pursuit is imbued with the possibility of many different kinds of successes, right? That the pursuit of an idea has meaning unto itself, and that it doesn't necessarily have to stand in front of the weight of all art history to be valid. And so that was a lot of how I was approaching the working with artists.
The process was equally as valid as the end result.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I would say that there's curators who like objects and curators who like artists. And they both have, an import and significance in making exhibitions or things happen, but they're really different different things. Like, I think about Pushing Image Paradigm a lot. I mean, it's one of the first shows that I walked into in town where I felt something, anything. And of course I thought at the time PICA was a massive organization because I couldn't, we all know that.
Because we had some really good design done from Plasm magazine.
That's right. Yeah, it was like, that time was like a real, incredible, Plasm was emerging. Brad Klofel did the design of the 4 walls in the exhibition as a young architect. Young designers and authors at Kristan Kennedy were contributing. Chris Riley in the interview, I remember the design of the catalog still holds up. But it really was the exhibition which featured international work, more work by women than I had sort of ever seen in an exhibition, happened in this really cool warehouse and felt really new and interesting and alive. But I had no idea who was behind it.
Yeah.
And I think that we're used to walking into a building and understanding that there's an institution behind something, and this felt, you know, unmoored, but also had a lot of potential. But I wonder how you feel about the idea of putting together a show or an exhibition versus working with artists on projects, because you did both.
Yeah.
But I wonder, you know, if you could talk about the difference, or, you know, I don't know, where your heart lies in that.
Well, I mean, when I was making exhibitions that had multiple artists in them, I would be looking, usually what would happen is you find one. There's one artist and the work completely blows you away, right? And then you go in this process where you're thinking to yourself, everyone I know has to see this work. And everyone I know is not with me right now. So, I mean, it's this simple. So how do I bring the work to everyone I know, right? And then you start to realize from something that that artist's work taught you to see, right? There's some gift exchange that it's teaching you to see something differently or anew because of the provocation, to be awake differently because of it. And that openness, then, to me anyway, when I'm working, I start to see similar strategies through different forms.